In 1815, right after the Battle of Waterloo, Britain's government debt had hit a staggering £1 billion, an amount that should have bankrupted any nation at the time. And yet, Britain was also the richest and most powerful empire in the world. This was possible because in the 18th century, Britain had discovered how to turn borrowing itself into a tool of economic domination. In this video, I want to argue that the British Empire became the most powerful not because of its famous Royal Navy, but because it mastered the use of debt, creating a financial system that allowed it to outspend every rival on Earth. Of course, that £1 billion debt didn't appear out of nowhere. The British Empire got to that position by over a century of non-stop global warfare. From 1692 to 1815, Britain spent 76 years of those waging wars with everyone, but mostly with its bitter rivals, France. And in this new era of conflict, war had become absurdly, cripplingly expensive. So, how does an empire fund its wars back then? Well, most European medieval kings don't have the cash. He has to borrow them. But this always meant going to a tiny, exclusive group of private bankers or wealthy nobles, like the Florentines or later the Dutch. They were the only ones with enough capital to fund a war. And this exposed the central, fatal flaw of old world finance. The king was a terrible borrower. You see, when a merchant borrows from a banker, the deal is protected by a court. If the merchant defaults, the banker can take him to court and seize his assets. But what happens when you lend money to a king? You cannot sue him. He is the court. The entire transaction isn't protected by law. It's protected by a single fragile asset, the king's reputation. This was a huge risk for the bankers. From the great Florentine families to the Dutch financiers, all were a part of an interconnected international network. A default of that scale was a global scandal that would be seen as a betrayal by pretty much all bankers and nobles. When King Edward III of England defaulted on his loans to Florentine bankers in 1339, he didn't just get away with it because he's a king. He caused the catastrophic collapse of the Bardi and Peruzzi banking houses, the titans of 14th century finance. That default wasn't forgotten for centuries. It stained the reputation of the English crown and made every future king a high-risk investment for these bankers. This history created the default trap phenomenon. Bankers knew a king wouldn't default casually. It was a suicidal last resort. But they also knew that in a desperate war, a king would be forced to choose between the kingdom's survival and paying the bankers back. Every king in the world would prefer to default his loans to the bankers rather than losing his throne and head to an angry mob every single time. So, the bankers priced in this risk. They charged 15 to 20% interest as a desperation insurance. And this creates a vicious cycle of self-destruction. The high interest rate made the empire poorer, repayments harder, and defaults more likely, which made the interest rates for the next loan even higher if it is even approved. This was the system England, soon to be the British Empire, had to change in order to win their wars and became a dominant force to the world. The Royal Navy was known as the most powerful naval force in the world, but that wasn't enough. Britain had to find a way to change the old system with an entirely new idea of borrowing concept, one that changes from relying on the reputation of the king to the credibility of the nation itself. So, how did this cycle of defaults end? Well, England found the solution by a revolution. In 1688, King James II was overthrown and was replaced by William and Mary, and with that came a reformation in the political system. Parliaments became supreme. The king didn't have absolute power to do whatever he wanted anymore. Taxes and spending required Parliament's approval, and the Bill of Rights in 1689 defined limits on royal power and protected personal property rights. This changed the borrower from the king itself, with a fragile personal reputation, to the Parliament, an institution run by wealthy merchants and landowners. This is the central idea that won Douglas North a Nobel Prize of Economics in 1993 with the paper I cited in the video description. He argued that for the first time, the lenders were voting on the taxes that would pay themselves back. They could lend safely knowing that they would eventually get paid back. The creation of the Bank of England in 1694 was done as a result of this political change, and the bank had one main job: to manage and finance this new national debt as a liquid, tradable, and reliable asset. For the first time, it showed the British state as a credible debtor. Lenders believed the government wouldn't default, and they lent massively as a result. Within 9 years, British debt grew 10x because people finally trusted the state to pay back. Interest rates fell from 14% to 3% by early 1700s. Government borrowing exploded without any inflation or increase in defaults. This new trustworthy system was eventually built into a thriving private market. The new government bonds created a massive liquid market for securities, allowing people to easily buy, sell, and trade debt for the first time through the bond market. It allowed banks to flourish and open locations across the kingdom rather than just in London. For the first time, an entrepreneur with a radical risky idea could now walk into a bank and get a credible loan and act upon his ideas. And this was the idea that gave England the financial muscle to fund the Royal Navy, fight global wars, fund the massive coalitions needed to defeat Napoleon's France, and became the center of the Industrial Revolution. The lesson you can learn from Douglas's paper is that you can't have thriving markets or innovation if rulers can easily rewrite the rules or seize someone's assets whenever they're short on cash. The institutions that tie the hands of the powerful aren't a barrier of capitalism. They are what make it work. Compare this to 17,000's France before Napoleon came along, which was a great example of how the old system works. On paper, France was the most populous nation in Europe, but its finances were an absolute catastrophe. Their tax system was a mess, and they spent far more than they brought in, even in peacetime. High loans, high interest rates, low income, desperate defaults, constant warfare, and an incompetent monarchy that parties all year long while the people suffers ended exactly how you expect, with the bloody French Revolution. While France was paying 10 to 20% interest on their loans, Britain was paying 3%. As long as Britain used its money well and kept paying back their loans, the British Empire will never run out of cash. It had become a financial superpower. Now, we explored a bit on private markets and how it thrived in this new system. I want to discuss more on this because the debt Britain owed and lended didn't just fund the military campaigns, it also funded the Industrial Revolution. The reason why Britain became the center of the Industrial Revolution was this. Imagine you're an entrepreneur in 1750. You have a radical, unproven idea for a new kind of steam engine. You go to a bank for a loan. Any banker rightly sees you and your idea as a huge risk. You see, banks in the 18th century were deeply conservative. They would not gamble their depositors' money on a radical, unproven idea for a factory that might just fail. The biggest problem with innovation is that the people with these brilliant ideas usually don't have the capital to execute them. Now, the 3% rate the government was paying became the new risk-free rate for the entire economy. Every other interest rate in the economy was then priced off what British government securities pays you. This one change transformed everything. A banker now had a baseline. I can get a guaranteed 3% from the government with zero risk. Therefore, to justify lending to anyone else, a merchant, a farmer, or a risky entrepreneur, they had to charge more than 3%, but they could no longer get away with charging 20%. This permanent low cost of capital was like fuel for the Industrial Revolution. It made building a factory or a canal fundamentally cheaper and more viable in Britain than anywhere else in the world. Second, and most critically, the government's debt built the entire modern financial industry from scratch. You see, to manage this billion-pound debt, Britain had to invent a modern financial system. It created the London Stock Exchange, not to trade company shares that came later on, but to create massive, liquid markets for these government bonds. It trained an entire class of professional brokers, bankers, and clerks whose entire job was to manage, trade, and service this new national debt. Britain had become the center of finance. So, when the entrepreneurs came along with a radical idea, the system was already in place to fund these ideas. The investors, who had learned their trade on the safe government bonds, now understood how to value and buy private securities. The brokers knew how to sell it, the stock exchange knew how to list it, and funding the next big thing became a thing among wealthy people thanks to a system that enables capital investment on a large scale. This was the debt into growth engine. The government's debt acted as a scaffolding that built the entire modern financial market. It was the biggest factor of why the economy was prepared to fund technological developments in textiles, steam power, iron making, and the invention of machine tools, which we now know as the Industrial Revolution. Now, after 1815, for almost 100 years, the system worked like a dream. This was the British peace. The Royal Navy protected global trade, and the Empire was the undisputed superpower with multiple colonies around the world. Britain was the world's banker, the world's factory, and the world's largest creditor as London became the source of global capital. It was lending its vast surplus of money out to the rest of the globe, funding everything from railroads in America to mines in Argentina. Its dominant position in the world trade effectively controlled economies outside its colonies like China and Argentina. But then, in 1914, something changed. World War I was an entirely different war any nation had ever fought before. It was a war of machine guns, mass conscriptions, and artillery shells that cost more per day than entire campaigns had cost against Napoleon. The war drained Britain in ways no one could have imagined. To pay for the war, Britain sold off its foreign investments, printed money on a scale never seen before, and borrowed heavily. But who do you borrow from when you are the world's bank? You borrow from one country that had taken your playbook and scaled it up, which is the United States. The British government had to turn to American bankers like J.P. Morgan, who personally financed the Allied war effort, lending them billions. By the time the war ended in 1918, a generation of young men was gone. The British Empire was still vast on paper, but its foundations were cracking. Another blow came during the 1929 Great Depression. Trade collapsed, unemployment soared. All of the British colonies became an economic burden rather than a blessing. By 1940, Britain was fighting for its literal survival against Nazi Germany, and it was broke. Britain once again went to the US not only for loans but also for food, weapons, ships, and fuel. The Land Lease Act saw the United States effectively become the world's main financier as it lent 31.4 billion US dollars to the United Kingdom, which is around $688 billion today adjusted for inflation. The massive loans helped Britain to survive World War II, but to be able to secure this lifeline post-war, Britain had to liquidate its vast overseas assets, the very investments it had built up over a century of being the world's banker. It sold off its factories, its railroads, and its companies in America, Argentina, and across the globe, often to American buyers at bargain bin prices. By the time the war ended in 1945, Britain was victorious, but financially hollowed out. A century ago, it had a staggering £1 billion debt, but it's also the world's largest creditor. In 1945, its total debt was over 250% of its GDP, and unlike the debt after Waterloo, this new crushing debt was owed to an external power, the United States. The 100-year reign of the British peace was over. Britain remained a victorious nation, but it was no longer the world's superpower. It was now a debtor, and its empire was already beginning to dissolve. But the system that Britain invented, the one that won it in the 19th century, moved across the Atlantic. The US dollar became the new global reserve currency. The US Treasury bill became the new risk-free asset that the entire global economy is now built upon. Now, the financial revolution was all about credibility. By creating institutions like a supreme parliament and a Bill of Rights that protected property rights and bound the hands of the ruler, Britain solved the king's default trap. That institutional trust is what made Britain a trustworthy debtor, the single most important development in its history. And it was that hard-won credibility, built not on a single person but on a system. That system, built on trustworthy low-interest debt, gave Britain the cheap money to fund the war that defeated Napoleon. It built the financial scaffolding that funded the Industrial Revolution. It became the banker for the entire planet for 100 years. Britain's system worked because its debt was seen as the safest asset in the world, until it wasn't. 2 world wars, costing more than anyone could have ever imagined, forced it to borrow more than its system could handle. The privilege of being the world's banker and the power that came with it simply passed to the United States. And that leaves us with the trillion-dollar question. The British model of debt-fueled supremacy, which the US inherited and improved, has now been running for over 75 years and still currently running well. But every system, however good it may be, has a breaking point. It raises the uncomfortable question: has the United States found a way to rewrite the rules of the game? Or is it just getting really good at ignoring the same warning signs that Britain gave us all over a century ago? This is Doverhill, and see you next time.